There is a thought living inside your head right now that has already decided your future. Not a loud thought, not a dramatic one, not the kind that announces itself with sirens and red flags so you can examine it carefully and choose whether to believe it. A quiet one, a thought so familiar, so deeply embedded in the way you see yourself and the world around you that it no longer feels like a thought at all. It feels like the truth. It feels like you. And here is what makes that terrifying. You have probably never once questioned it. More than 100 years ago, a man named William Walker Atkinson sat down and wrote something that the scientific establishment of his time was not ready for. It was not a long book. It was not complicated. But it contained an idea so precise, so uncomfortably accurate about the way human beings actually work, that it quietly influenced every major self-development writer who came after him: Napoleon Hill, Neville Goddard, Wallace Wattles, often without those writers giving him the credit he deserved. The book was called Thought Vibration. And before you dismiss that title as something mystical or outdated, I want you to stay with me for a moment. Because what Atkinson was pointing at, underneath all the language of his era, was something we can now see confirmed in how attention works, how habits form, how identity is built, and how human beings unconsciously sabotage themselves in ways they never detect. This is not going to be a history lesson about an old book. This is going to be about you, your mind, the thoughts you carry around without realizing you're carrying them. The invisible process happening right now in this moment that is shaping what you'll notice today, what decisions you'll make this week, and what kind of person you'll believe yourself to be 5 years from now. But here's what nobody tells you about the power of thought. The thoughts that are ruining your life are not the ones making you suffer. Those ones you know about. Those ones you fight. Those ones you try to replace with affirmations at 6 in the morning while standing in front of the bathroom mirror. The thoughts that are actually controlling your life are the ones you stopped noticing. The ones that became so familiar they disappeared into the background and started operating like the operating system of a computer. Invisible, automatic, running everything while you focus on the screen in front of you. By the time we finish today, you may discover something uncomfortable, something that changes how you interpret the last several years of your life, something that reveals why certain things keep repeating themselves no matter how hard you try to change them. Are you ready? Because we're going to go deep. Distinction. 1. Not every thought carries the same weight. Let me ask you something. How many thoughts have passed through your mind today? Researchers who study cognitive load estimate that the average person experiences somewhere between 6,000 and 70,000 thoughts in a single day. The range is enormous because it depends on how you define a thought. But let's agree on something simpler. A lot of mental activity is happening inside you every single waking hour. Most of those thoughts are weightless. They arrive, exist briefly, and evaporate. You think about the email you forgot to send. You wonder whether you turned off the stove. You notice that the coffee is too hot. These thoughts do not accumulate. They do not build. They leave no significant trace. But Atkinson identified something that most people completely overlook. Some thoughts return, and every time a thought returns, something changes. Not dramatically, not visibly, but something shifts in the architecture of your mind. The thought becomes slightly easier to think again. The neural pathway it travels becomes marginally more worn, more familiar, more automatic. The mind begins to treat it not as a visitor passing through, but as a resident with a permanent address. Atkinson called these dominant thoughts, and he believed, correctly, that they operate completely differently from passing ones. Here is how this works in real life. Imagine you're preparing for a job interview. You've done your research. You know your material. But as you're getting ready that morning, a thought appears. I'm not sure I'm actually qualified for this. Now, if that thought passes through your mind once and disappears, it means almost nothing. A moment of doubt before a high-stakes situation is completely normal. It's your nervous system doing its job. But what if that thought has a history? What if a version of that same thought appeared before your last interview and the interview before that? What if it showed up when you were asked to lead a meeting, when you considered applying for a promotion, when someone praised your work and your internal response was, they don't know what they're talking about? Now we're not dealing with a passing doubt. We're dealing with a dominant thought. And a dominant thought is a completely different creature. A passing thought asks a question. Am I qualified? A dominant thought has already decided the answer. I'm not. Atkinson's first and most foundational distinction is this: the difference between a thought that moves through your mind and a thought that has made a home there is not a small difference. It is everything. Because a dominant thought does not wait for you to consciously invite it. It shows up automatically. It shapes your experience before you even know it's operating. Think about someone who has spent years believing that people can't be trusted, not because they decided to believe that, not because they sat down one day and made a conscious choice, but because a series of painful experiences, combined with repeated internal commentary, gradually cemented that conclusion into something that feels like wisdom. For this person, every new relationship begins already filtered. A friend who cancels plans isn't just busy, they're unreliable. A colleague who seems warm is probably working an angle. A partner who is kind today will eventually reveal their true nature. The dominant thought has become a lens, and every new experience gets interpreted through it. The thought is not processing reality. The thought is constructing reality. This is Atkinson's first explosive insight, and it is one that most people spend their entire lives never understanding. Your mind is not a neutral observer of your life. It is an active interpreter, and the interpreter has been quietly trained by years of repetition to reach certain conclusions automatically, before the evidence is even examined. So here's the question you need to sit with. What thought keeps coming back? Not the dramatic one, not the crisis thought that appears during your worst moments. I mean the quiet background thought. The one that shows up when you're about to try something new. The one that surfaces when someone offers you a compliment. The one that whispers underneath your ambition like a persistent, familiar voice. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at this. Things always seem to work out for other people, not for me. I'll probably mess this up like I mess everything up. No matter what I do, it's never quite enough. These aren't dramatic statements. That's the point. They're subtle. They sound almost reasonable. And because they sound reasonable, you've probably never seriously questioned them. But here's what Atkinson understood that most of us miss completely. The thought that sounds most like common sense is often the most dangerous one. Because common sense doesn't get examined. Common sense just is, And when a thought stops being examined, it starts being obeyed. There is a critical moment in the life of any belief where it transitions from something I think to something I know. That transition is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But once it happens, the thought has gained a kind of gravitational pull that makes it extraordinarily difficult to escape. You can see this in the way people talk about themselves in casual conversation. Pay attention the next time you're with a group of friends and the conversation turns to money or relationships or career ambitions. Notice how many times people say things like, "That's just not how my luck works," or "I've always been terrible with numbers," or "I'm just not a confident person." These statements are delivered not as opinions, but as facts. Nobody challenges them. Nobody says, "Wait, how long have you believed that? Is that actually true?" They pass as self-evident truths, quietly reinforced by the social context, and the person who said them leaves the conversation having just rehearsed a dominant thought one more time. Each rehearsal makes the thought stronger. Each repetition makes it more automatic. Each automatic activation makes it more invisible. This is the mechanism Atkinson identified over a century ago, and it is still running inside you right now. Distinction 2. Your dominant thought decides what you see. Now we get to something even more unsettling. Once a thought becomes dominant, once it has been repeated enough times and accepted with enough emotional investment, it begins doing something remarkable and deeply problematic. It begins filtering your experience of reality. Atkinson described this through the language of vibration and attraction. He believed that a person who sustained a particular mental state would naturally become more receptive to thoughts, influences, and even circumstances that match that state. Fear would draw more fear. Confidence would attract ideas aligned with confidence. Resentment would keep assembling evidence of injustice. Modern neuroscience gives us a slightly different but compatible explanation through the concept of the reticular activating system, the part of your brain that acts as a filter for the enormous flood of sensory information you encounter every second. Your brain cannot consciously process everything around you, so it makes decisions about what matters. And those decisions are heavily influenced by what you already believe is important. Here's a simple example you may have experienced yourself. Have you ever decided you wanted to buy a specific car, let's say a dark green SUV, and suddenly started seeing dark green SUVs everywhere? On the highway, in parking lots, in commercials. As if overnight the entire world filled up with them. The cars didn't multiply, the world didn't change, your attention changed. The dark green SUV went from being irrelevant background noise to being a marked, significant object that your brain was now scanning for. Now, apply that same process to a belief about yourself or your life. If you carry the dominant thought, "I am the kind of person who gets overlooked," your attention becomes exquisitely sensitive to any evidence that supports that conclusion. A colleague receives credit for a project you contributed to. Confirmation. Your message in a group chat gets no responses for an hour. Confirmation. Someone at a social event doesn't remember your name. Confirmation. Meanwhile, the contradictory evidence, the time your manager specifically highlighted your contribution in a team meeting, the way your closest friends light up when you walk into a room, the colleague who went out of their way to tell you that your feedback changed how they approached a problem, your mind barely registers those. or it processes them through the filter of the dominant thought. They were just being polite. That was a one-time thing. They're only saying that because they want something. This is not weakness. This is not stupidity. This is the architecture of a mind that has been organized around a particular conclusion and is now unconsciously working to protect that conclusion from being disturbed. Atkinson called this entering a current of thought vibration. Your dominant mental state, he argued, creates a kind of gravitational field that pulls certain experiences into sharp focus while allowing others to pass unnoticed. Think about two people sitting in the same business seminar. Both hear the same speaker. Both receive the same information. The first person carries a dominant thought. People like me don't build successful businesses. That's for a certain type of person. Bold, connected, naturally gifted, and I'm not that person. This person's attention catches every statement that confirms the difficulty, every statistic about failure rates, every nuanced caveat the speaker offers, every audience member who asks a sophisticated question that this person doesn't know the answer to. By the end of the seminar, they leave feeling more confirmed in their original conclusion. See? It's complicated. It's for people who already know what they're doing. The second person carries a different dominant thought. There's something useful here for me if I pay attention. This person's attention catches the actionable insights, the concrete examples, the one framework the speaker mentioned that clicks perfectly with a problem they've been struggling with, the contact information on the final slide. By the end of the same seminar, they leave with 3 specific ideas to implement and 1 email to send. Same room, same speaker, same words, completely different experience, because they were not looking for the same world. This is the practical meaning of what Atkinson was describing. Your dominant thought does not simply reflect your experience of life, it actively curates it. It decides before you consciously choose which parts of reality receive your attention and which ones get quietly filtered out. And here's the part that makes this particularly difficult to detect. The process feels completely objective. It doesn't feel like filtering. It feels like noticing things as they actually are. The person who believes they're always overlooked does not think, "My mind is selecting evidence for a predetermined conclusion." They think, "I'm just paying attention to reality." The thought has become the invisible lens through which reality is interpreted, and you cannot easily see a lens you're looking through. So, what do you do with this? Atkinson's first practical suggestion is not to replace the thought, not yet. He advises something simpler and more powerful. Interrupt the monopoly. Ask your mind a specific kind of question. Not, "Why does this always happen to me?" That question accepts the dominant thought's conclusion as accurate and simply asks for a cause. Ask instead, "What is my mind currently excluding from my attention?" If your dominant thought says nobody appreciates my work, ask, "What evidence of appreciation have I dismissed this week?" If your dominant thought says things never work out for me, ask, "What has worked out? And why did I decide it didn't count?" If your dominant thought says I always end up alone, ask, "Who in my life actually shows up for me? And why does my mind treat their presence as less significant than their absence?" You are not trying to force yourself to be positive. You are conducting an audit of your own attention. You are asking the mind to account for what it has been quietly discarding. Because the dominant thought doesn't just tell you what to believe, it teaches you what to notice. And what you consistently notice becomes what you consistently experience. The circuit is elegant and invisible, and we've only just begun to trace it. Distinction 3. A thought can make your decision. Before you do, let's talk about something that most people find deeply uncomfortable when they first encounter it. The idea that you are not always the one making your decisions. Before you push back on that, before the part of you that believes in free will and personal agency starts raising objections, let me be precise about what I mean. I'm not saying you have no agency. I'm not saying your choices don't matter. I'm saying that between the moment a decision becomes available and the moment you consciously respond to it, there is a gap. And in that gap, a dominant thought is often already working. Atkinson believed that thought naturally seeks expression. A mental state repeated enough times, he argued, inevitably finds its way into speech, into habits, into the micro-decisions that collectively shape a life. The thought begins inside, invisible. But it does not stay invisible. It eventually surfaces as behavior, often in ways the person never directly traces back to the thought itself. Here is how this looks in practice. Imagine someone who has spent years with the quiet background belief that ambitious people end up disappointed, not a belief they chose consciously. Maybe it came from watching a parent work hard and get passed over repeatedly. Maybe it crystallized from a period in their 20s when they went after something big and it didn't work out. Maybe it was assembled from dozens of small observations and cultural messages over time. The belief doesn't announce itself, but it is present. Now, this person is scrolling through a professional platform one afternoon and they see a job posting. The role is a significant step up. More responsibility, more visibility, substantially higher compensation. Everything about it aligns with what they say they want when someone asks about their career goals. And here is where the dominant thought begins its work. Not dramatically, not consciously, but in the form of a series of perfectly reasonable-sounding internal observations. The requirements are pretty specific. I probably don't tick every box. They've likely already identified someone internally for this role. If I apply and don't get it, that's going to sting. Better to apply when I'm more ready. I should research the company more thoroughly before sending anything. The timing isn't ideal. I'm in the middle of several projects right now. None of these thoughts sounds like self-sabotage. Each one sounds like measured, responsible thinking. That is precisely what makes the dominant thought so effective. It doesn't say you're not good enough. Don't bother. It arrives disguised as caution, as wisdom, as strategic patience. The person closes the browser tab. Later, if someone asks why they didn't apply, they might say the timing wasn't right, or the role wasn't quite the right fit, or they decided to focus on their current position. These explanations are not lies. The person genuinely believes them. But the real author of the decision was not careful strategic thinking. It was an old belief that ambitious people end up disappointed, and the mind's job was to generate plausible reasons for not taking the risk. This is what Atkinson meant when he said thought influences behavior before it announces itself. The thought doesn't need to control your conscious mind. It only needs to shape the landscape of options you seriously consider. Once it has done that, your conscious mind gets to choose freely from among a set of options that has already been curated by the dominant belief. You feel like you made a free choice. In one sense, you did. But the menu was prepared in advance. Now let's make this personal, because this is where Atkinson's ideas stop being abstract and start being genuinely useful. Think about an area of your life where you repeatedly don't follow through. Not because you're lazy, I don't believe you're lazy, but because something keeps creating a reason not to, a hesitation, a redirection, a perfectly logical explanation for why now isn't the right time. Health and fitness, financial planning, a creative project you've been about to start for longer than feels comfortable to admit, a conversation you need to have with someone important to you, a skill you've been meaning to develop for years. What is the dominant thought underneath the repeated non-action? Because it's there. It's always there. And it is far more specific than "I'm not motivated" or "I'm too busy." Those are surface explanations. The dominant thought underneath them is something more precise, a belief about what will happen if you try, what it will reveal about you, what it will require you to give up, or what kind of person does or doesn't do things like that. Atkinson argued that the direction and quality of a person's effort is as important as the effort itself. Two people can put in the same number of hours, the same observable commitment, and achieve radically different results. Not because of talent, not because of resources, but because one is operating from a mental position that supports effective action, while the other is operating from one that subtly undermines it. Consider what happens when two people face the same professional feedback. Your presentation skills need significant development. The first person hears this, and their dominant thought, "I can improve at almost anything with focused practice," frames it as information. They identify two specific areas to work on. They ask a colleague who excels at presenting if they can observe them in action. They sign up for a communication course. 6 months later, they are noticeably better. The second person hears the same feedback and their dominant thought, "I'm just not a natural communicator and that's not going to change," frames it as confirmation. They feel temporarily embarrassed. They tell themselves they'll work on it. But the dominant thought has already decided that significant improvement isn't really available for someone like them. So the work they put in is tentative, inconsistent, and stops well before real skill has developed. 1 year later, the first person is presenting confidently. The second person is still managing their discomfort and hoping it won't come up too often. The feedback was identical. The intelligence was comparable. The difference was the mental position from which the effort began. This is Atkinson's third distinction, and it may be the most practically significant one. A thought doesn't need to stop you from acting. It only needs to influence how you act. It shapes your preparation, your persistence, your willingness to stay with something long enough for improvement to become visible. A thought that whispers, "You're probably going to fail at this," doesn't necessarily prevent you from beginning, but it may cause you to begin with one foot already pointed toward the exit. To keep your commitment conditional. To interpret the first serious difficulty as evidence that you were right to doubt yourself from the start. And when you eventually stop, as the thought predicted you would, the result looks like a confirmation of reality, rather than the product of a self-fulfilling process. This is deeply important to understand because it means that changing behavior requires more than willpower. It requires examining the mental position from which the behavior is attempted. You cannot sustainably act like a confident person from a mental position organized around the belief that you are fundamentally inadequate. Not because it's impossible to force yourself for a short period. It is possible, but because the effort of constantly acting against your dominant thought is exhausting, and the moment your energy drops, the old pattern reasserts itself. Sustainable change requires changing the dominant thought, or at minimum, introducing enough contradictory evidence that the thought loses its monopoly over your interpretation of your own life. Atkinson was clear about this. He was not suggesting that thought could replace effort. He was insisting that thought influences the direction, quality, and endurance of effort in ways that make an enormous cumulative difference over time. So here is the practice for this distinction. Don't just ask what you want to achieve. Ask what your current dominant thought is causing you to do and not do in relation to that goal. Does it cause you to prepare thoroughly, or to prepare just enough to feel like you tried? Does it cause you to speak clearly about what you want, or to hint at it indirectly and hope the other person figures it out? Does it cause you to stay engaged with a difficult process long enough to develop real skill, or to exit at the first sign that this is going to require more from you than feels comfortable? Does it cause you to invest fully in a plan, or to keep a quiet exit available from the beginning because you already expect it to fail? A belief does not live only in your head. It lives in your behavior patterns. And your behavior patterns, compounded over months and years, produce the results that then seem to confirm the original belief. The circuit completes itself quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly until you learn to look for it. Distinction 4. Other people are reading you before you speak. There is something Atkinson wrote that I want to be honest with you about. He believed that thoughts radiated outward from a person like invisible energy, that a dominant mental state could be detected by other people and even transmitted across distances, influencing those who were in a receptive state. He wrote about this with great confidence and considerable specificity. And I'm not going to pretend the claim is straightforward or scientifically established. It isn't. The idea of thoughts traveling through space as detectable vibrations is not something current research confirms. But here is what I want you to notice. Atkinson was pointing at something real. He just didn't have the language to describe it precisely. What he was observing, and what we can now explain with considerably more precision, is that your internal state communicates far more information than your words do, and it communicates it faster than your words do. Before you finish your first sentence, the person in front of you has already begun processing hundreds of subtle signals: your posture, your muscle tension, the micro-expressions crossing your face, the quality and pace of your breathing, the tonality and rhythm of your voice, the way your eyes are moving. Their nervous system is performing a rapid, largely unconscious assessment of your emotional state. And it is remarkably accurate. We are wired for this. Human beings evolved in small social groups where the ability to accurately read the emotional state of others was critical for survival. We are extraordinarily good at detecting incongruence, the gap between what someone is saying and what their body and nervous system are actually communicating. So what happens when you enter an important conversation from a mental position of, "I don't expect to be taken seriously"? You may have prepared your points carefully. Your argument may be genuinely solid. But the dominant thought is shaping your physical presentation in ways you may not be aware of. You speak slightly faster than normal because some part of you wants to get through this before they dismiss you. You over-explain, adding qualifications and caveats that weren't in your original plan, because the dominant thought is preemptively softening your position before the rejection arrives. You interpret a neutral facial expression as skepticism and begin adjusting your argument in response to resistance that hasn't actually appeared yet. The person across from you cannot hear your dominant thought, but they are processing all of its behavioral consequences in real time. And here is what makes this genuinely important. Their response to those signals then becomes the data your dominant thought uses to confirm itself. They seem slightly confused by your over-explained qualification-heavy presentation. They ask a clarifying question. Your dominant thought interprets this as evidence that they're not taking you seriously. You become more defensive. Your delivery becomes less clear. Their confusion increases. By the end of the conversation, you leave with the confirmed belief, I told you, people don't take me seriously. But the belief created the behavior. The behavior shaped the interaction. The interaction produced the result. And the result was then used to justify the belief. Atkinson saw this cycle operating everywhere in human interaction. He described it as the creation of a personal mental atmosphere, a quality that preceded your words and influenced how people responded to you before you had finished your opening sentence. Now consider what changes when the dominant thought shifts. Think about someone you know personally who has what you might describe as natural authority or presence. Someone who, when they walk into a room, somehow communicates calm competence before they've said a word. Someone who, when they make a request, receives a different quality of response than other people making the same request. Is this person physically different? Louder? More aggressive? Usually not. What they have is coherence. Their internal state and their external expression are aligned. They're not spending energy managing the gap between what they're projecting and what they actually believe. That absence of internal conflict translates into a clarity and steadiness that others respond to. Atkinson called this genuine personal influence, and he was insistent that it could not be manufactured through technique alone. You can learn confident body language. You can practice powerful vocal patterns. But if those learned behaviors are sitting on top of a dominant thought that says, I'm fundamentally not enough, the incongruence is detectable. Not always consciously, but it registers. People sense something is off, and they respond to that sensing, even if they can't articulate what they're responding to. This doesn't mean you need to achieve some state of perfect inner peace before you can be effective with other people. That's not the standard. The standard is direction. Are your internal state and your external expression moving in roughly the same direction? Or are you spending most of your energy managing a significant gap between them? Atkinson's practical guidance here is to examine the internal position from which you enter important interactions. Not your talking points, not your strategy, your state. Are you entering this conversation to offer something you genuinely believe is valuable? Or are you entering it to try to overcome an internal assumption that the other person has already dismissed you? Are you setting a limit because you've made a genuine decision about what works for you? Or are you hoping the other person will be kind enough to figure out what you're afraid to say directly? Are you listening to understand? Or are you listening to confirm what you already expect to hear? The answers to those questions reveal the dominant thought underneath the interaction. And the dominant thought underneath the interaction is what the other person is actually responding to. This is why changing your script doesn't always change your results. Words are the surface. The dominant thought is the operating system, and you can update the words as many times as you like without changing what the other person is actually receiving. Distinction 5. A thought reaches its greatest power when it becomes your identity. I want to walk you through a transition that happens so gradually most people never notice it occurring. It begins with a specific experience. Something goes wrong. Something you attempted didn't work. Something you hoped for didn't materialize. A relationship ended badly. A project collapsed. A financial decision backfired. A conversation went in the worst possible direction. In the immediate aftermath of that experience, you have a thought about it. A natural, understandable, situation-specific thought. That didn't work. Or, I handled that poorly. Or, that hurt more than I expected. These are event-level thoughts. They describe what happened. They are limited in scope. They are, importantly, correctable because they point to a situation, and situations can be examined, learned from, and left behind. But then something happens. The thought begins to expand. That didn't work becomes things like, that never worked out for me. I handled that poorly becomes, I always handle things like that poorly. That hurt more than I expected becomes, I keep ending up in situations that hurt me. And then, the final, most consequential step. I'm just not someone things work out for. I'm just not someone who handles situations like that well. I'm just not someone who can protect themselves from getting hurt. Do you see what happened there? The thought traveled from describing an event to describing a person. From this didn't work to I am someone for whom things don't work. From a past experience to a permanent identity. And this transition, this seemingly small linguistic and psychological shift, is where a thought acquires its most devastating power. Because an identity is not something you argue with. An identity is not something you examine for accuracy. An identity is something you inhabit. It becomes the frame through which everything else is interpreted. Atkinson did not use the specific vocabulary of identity that we use today. But the process he described in Thought Vibration maps onto it precisely. He wrote about how sustained thought produces a mental state, and how that mental state eventually expresses itself as character, as the consistent, automatic way a person shows up in every area of their life. Let's make this as concrete as possible, because abstract understanding is not enough here. Imagine two people who both made poor financial decisions in their late 20s, invested money they couldn't afford to lose. Both lost it. Same experience, roughly. The first person processes this as a specific event with specific causes. I made a decision without enough information. I let enthusiasm override due diligence. I need to develop a more disciplined approach to financial risk. The experience becomes a data point that informs future decisions. It's painful, but it's instructive. Over the following years, this person develops better financial habits, builds a more stable situation, and occasionally references the experience as something that taught them something important. The second person processes the same experience through a different lens. This is just typical for me. I've always been bad with money. I don't have the kind of mind that's good at this stuff. The experience doesn't become a data point. It becomes a defining characteristic. And because it's now an identity, it shapes everything that follows. When this person encounters a financial opportunity, the identity activates before the opportunity is properly evaluated. That's not really for someone like me. When they receive advice about investing, saving, or building wealth, it passes through the filter. That makes sense for certain kinds of people, not for me. When they make another poor financial decision, as everyone occasionally does, it doesn't feel like a decision that went wrong. It feels like confirmation. See, this is just who I am. The identity has made the outcome feel inevitable, and the feeling of inevitability then reduces the quality of future effort. Because why invest significant energy in something that is simply part of who you are and therefore unlikely to change? This is the trap. Not the original bad decision, not even the repeated pattern. The trap is the step where a pattern of behavior gets reclassified as a quality of self. Atkinson observed that once a mental habit becomes sufficiently established, it operates almost automatically. The person continues feeding it with attention and emotional investment without recognizing that they are participating in its maintenance. The thought has graduated from being something they think to being something they are, and that graduation removes it from the domain of conscious examination. Here is something important to notice about how this affects the people around you. When someone who has organized their identity around inadequacy receives genuine encouragement, the encouragement cannot simply be absorbed as information. It has to be processed through the identity first, and the identity rejects it, because encouragement that contradicts the identity is actually threatening. It challenges the organized, coherent picture of self that the person has been building and defending often for years. So the compliment becomes politeness. They're just being kind. The success becomes luck. That went better than it normally would. The progress becomes a temporary anomaly. I'll probably fall back into my old pattern soon. The identity is protecting itself, not out of malice, not out of stubbornness, but because a coherent, organized self-concept, even a limiting one, is preferable to the psychological discomfort of uncertainty. The mind would rather be wrong consistently than not know what to expect. This explains something that puzzles a lot of people who are serious about personal development. Why do some people seem to absorb positive experiences and grow from them, while others seem to deflect the very experiences that could change their lives? It's not that the second group is less intelligent or less motivated. It's that their dominant identity has become organized around a particular conclusion, and that conclusion is actively filtering out contradictory evidence. Now, and this is where it becomes genuinely hopeful, rather than just analytically interesting. The same mechanism that creates limiting identities can create expanding ones, because identity is not a thing you are. Identity is a story you've told yourself so many times that it has stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like a fact. And a story, once you recognize it as a story, can be examined, can be questioned, can be revised. Not overnight, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the patient, deliberate introduction of new evidence. Atkinson believed that a mental habit, like any habit, was something practiced. It was not something you were born with. It was not permanent. It was something that had been repeated in thought, in interpretation, in behavior, until it felt natural, and what had been practiced could be practiced differently. The crucial step is not to replace the limiting identity with an inflated positive one. That approach typically fails because the mind has contradictory evidence it cannot simply ignore. If you've spent 10 years identifying as someone who can't follow through, repeating, "I am someone who always finishes what they start," will likely produce more cognitive resistance than genuine change. The more credible transition is smaller and more honest. I have developed a pattern of stopping before completion. That pattern was practiced. It is not permanent. I have made financial decisions I'm not proud of. Those decisions reflect a set of behaviors I haven't yet changed, not a quality of character that I cannot change. I have avoided difficult conversations. That's a learned response to the discomfort of conflict. It can be unlearned. Do you feel the difference? These statements don't pretend the pattern isn't real. They change its meaning. They reclassify it from essence to behavior, from what you are to what you have done repeatedly. And behaviors can be changed. Patterns can be interrupted. Evidence can accumulate in a new direction. But here is the prerequisite that Atkinson kept returning to and that I want you to hold on to. Before you can change an identity, you have to be able to see it. You have to recover the distance between yourself and the thought, the distance that disappeared when I think became I am. So here's your practice for this distinction. For the next few days, listen for your I am statements. Not the ones you say proudly and with confidence, but the ones that close conversations about yourself, to yourself, in the running internal commentary that most people never examine directly. I am just that way. I have never been able to do that. I am not someone who is good at this. I am the kind of person who always ends up here. When you catch one, ask a single question. Is this a fact about my nature, or is this a description of a pattern I have practiced? You don't need to fight it. You don't need to immediately replace it. You simply need to move it from the category of fact back into the category of thought. Because a thought that can be observed is no longer invisible, and a thought that is no longer invisible has lost its most powerful advantage. Distinction. 6. Fighting a thought can make it stronger. Here's something I want you to try right now. For the next 15 seconds, do not think about a golden door. Don't picture the color of it. Don't imagine how it might feel under your hand. Don't wonder what might be waiting on the other side. Don't think about the golden door. How did that go? Exactly. This is what psychologists sometimes call the rebound effect of thought suppression, and it is one of the most practically significant discoveries in the study of the mind. When you actively try not to think about something, you must first bring that something to mind in order to check whether you're thinking about it. And that checking process keeps the very thought you're trying to eliminate at the center of your attention. Atkinson identified this principle over a century before it was formally studied, and it has profound implications for how you approach the dominant thoughts in your own mind. Most people, when they become aware of a limiting belief, make a very understandable mistake. They decide to fight it, to argue with it, to catch it every time it appears and immediately counter it with a more positive statement, to monitor it constantly, checking whether it has weakened yet, whether it's still showing up, whether the work they're doing to eliminate it is finally taking effect. And in doing so, they accidentally place that limiting belief at the permanent center of their mental life. I must stop thinking that I'm not capable. Now you're thinking about not being capable. I cannot keep returning to this fear. Now the fear is the main subject. I need to eliminate this belief about myself. Now, the belief is front and center. The war against the thought is just another way of keeping the thought at the top of the agenda. Atkinson's solution was elegant and non-obvious. He did not advise suppression. He did not advise argument. He advised redirection. The distinction is critical. Suppression says, this thought must not exist. Redirection says, this thought does not have to receive my continued attention. Suppression fights for control of the same territory. Redirection moves to different territory entirely. Here's how this works in practice. Let's say you're preparing for a significant professional opportunity and a familiar thought appears. I'm probably going to underperform. This is the kind of thing I always blow. The suppression approach spends the next 3 hours wrestling with that thought, arguing with it, trying to convince yourself it isn't true, monitoring whether it's still there, checking your confidence levels every few minutes. By the time the opportunity arrives, the dominant subject of your mental preparation has been failure. You've given it hours of focused attention. You've rehearsed it extensively. The irony is devastating. You were trying to prevent failure while mentally preparing for almost nothing else. The redirection approach does something different. When the thought appears, you acknowledge it, not with resistance, not with alarm, but with the calm recognition that this is a familiar pattern. Yes, this thought appears when I'm about to do something that matters. I've noticed this before. And then you redirect attention to something specific and actionable. What is the one thing I want to make sure I communicate clearly in this opportunity? What preparation would make me more genuinely ready? What question should I be able to answer confidently? The limiting thought may return. You redirect again. It may return once more. You redirect again. Not fighting, not suppressing, not monitoring for its continued presence, simply bringing your attention back to the direction you have chosen. This is fundamentally different from positive affirmations applied as a band-aid over an unchanged, dominant thought. Atkinson was clear about this. He recognized that if you attempt to jump from a deeply embedded limiting belief to an inflated positive claim, the mind will reject the claim as incoherent. It has too much contradictory evidence. The gap is too large. I am terrible at presentations cannot simply become I am an extraordinary communicator overnight. The distance is too great, and the mind knows it. But it can become something like, I feel nervous before presentations, and nervousness does not prevent me from being clear. Or, I have given presentations that went poorly, and I have also given presentations that went fine. The outcome is not predetermined. These statements don't claim false confidence. They interrupt the automatic authority that the limiting thought has assumed over your experience. They create just enough cognitive space that a different response becomes possible. There's another dimension to this that Atkinson emphasized and that I want to be direct about: the relationship between thought and action. One of the most powerful ways to redirect attention away from a limiting thought is not to think more. It is to do something. The person who has spent years telling themselves they never finish anything does not primarily need more internal dialogue about finishing things. They need to finish something small, something specific, something manageable enough that completion is genuinely possible within a short time frame, not because one completed task erases years of repetition, but because the completed task creates actual evidence, real, undeniable experiential evidence that contradicts the dominant thought. And evidence accumulated patiently and consistently, eventually creates the conditions in which a different thought becomes credible. Atkinson was insistent about the role of what he called concentration in this process, not the white-knuckled force of will concentration that exhausts you within an hour, the concentration of return. The mind wanders as it will. You bring it back. The limiting thought appears as it may. You acknowledge it and redirect. The old pattern asserts itself as it sometimes does. You notice it and return to the chosen direction. The strength is not in preventing every interruption. The strength is in making the return your consistent choice, because every return is itself a practice, and every practice, repeated, becomes gradually more natural, until one day you notice that returning to a particular direction has stopped requiring significant effort, not because the limiting thought has been destroyed, but because you have developed a stronger competing habit. The limiting thought hasn't been conquered. It has simply been deprioritized by a mind that has found something more valuable to do with its attention. That, in Atkinson's framework, is mental control. Not the absence of unwanted thoughts, not perfect internal silence, not a mind that never doubts or fears or hesitates. A mind that knows how to come back. Distinction 7. Willpower is not force. It is the art of return. When most people talk about willpower, they're describing a battle. One part of them wants to act. Another part resists. And willpower is the force used to overpower the resistance, to push through, muscle past the doubt, override the hesitation through sheer determination. And that model of willpower does work. Sometimes. For a while. Under specific conditions. But it has a fundamental problem. It treats the mind as an adversary that must be defeated, rather than a faculty that must be directed. And adversaries, when consistently fought, tend to develop increasingly effective counter-strategies. The harder you push, the more sophisticated the resistance becomes. Atkinson had a completely different understanding of will. For him, willpower was not a weapon wielded against the mind. It was the faculty that chooses a direction and keeps returning to it. Not through force, through consistent, patient, undramatic return. This distinction sounds subtle. The practical difference is enormous. The force model of willpower depends on sustained intensity. You need to feel motivated, energized, certain about your direction. You need the emotional charge that surrounded the original decision to remain strong enough to override resistance. And the problem with emotional intensity is that it is, by nature, temporary. The motivation of Sunday evening has often become the ambivalence of Wednesday afternoon. The clarity of a powerful decision fades into the background noise of ordinary life. If willpower requires sustained intensity, it will eventually run out. And when it does, the old pattern, which required no intensity to maintain because it was automatic, reasserts itself. But if willpower is the repeated act of return, of choosing the direction again and again and again, without drama and without requiring that the original emotional charge still be present, then it is not dependent on intensity. It is dependent on practice. And practice, unlike intensity, can be sustained indefinitely. Atkinson wrote about this with considerable precision. He observed that the people who achieved the most consistent results were not the ones who experienced the strongest initial bursts of motivation. They were the ones who had developed the habit of returning to their chosen direction after each interruption, calmly, without extensive self-judgment, without requiring a renewed sense of inspiration before they could continue. He called this developed concentration, and he was clear that it was a developed capacity, not a gift, not a personality trait, not something you either had or didn't. It was a faculty strengthened through use, like any other. Let me give you a concrete image for this. Imagine two people committed to developing a new professional skill. Both are beginners. Both face the same initial learning curve, the frustrating period where you know enough to see how much you don't know, but not enough to feel any real competence. The first person has tremendous initial intensity. They immerse themselves completely for the first 2 weeks. But when the inevitable plateau arrives, when progress becomes less visible, when the skill starts requiring more precision and patience than the exciting early phase, the intensity fades. The person interprets the fading intensity as a signal that something is wrong. I've lost my motivation. Maybe this isn't the right direction for me. Maybe I'm not as suited for this as I thought. They step back to reassess. The reassessment becomes an extended pause. The extended pause becomes quietly a stop. The second person begins with less intensity but more consistency. They work on the skill for a specific, manageable amount of time each day. Not all day, not in bursts of enthusiasm, but reliably. When the plateau arrives, they notice the reduced excitement and continue anyway, not because they've discovered some secret to maintaining motivation, but because they have decided that continuation is the plan, regardless of how they feel about it on any particular day. 6 months later, the first person is back at the beginning, or not beginning at all. The second person has passed through the plateau and is into genuine competence. Same initial desire, same intelligence, vastly different results. Not because of talent, because of a different relationship with the experience of resistance. Atkinson would say the second person was exercising the will, not through force, through return. Now, let's apply this to the specific challenge of changing a dominant thought or a limiting identity, because this is where Atkinson's understanding of will becomes most practically significant. Suppose you've identified a dominant thought. Let's say it's the very common and very limiting belief that you don't have the kind of personality that connects easily with people, that you're fundamentally awkward in social situations, that other people naturally find each other while you have to work for every connection. You've recognized this as a dominant thought. You've traced its effects on your behavior. You understand intellectually that it may not be an accurate description of your nature, but rather a pattern practiced over time. Now what? The instinct is to try to change the thought through argument and affirmation, to tell yourself you are good with people, to catch every instance of the limiting belief and replace it with a positive counterstatement, to try to feel differently. Atkinson's approach is more structural and ultimately more effective. It begins not with how you feel about yourself, but with what you do. He advised what he called expressing thought through action, giving the chosen direction a concrete behavioral form that was specific enough to be actually performed. Not I want to become better at connecting with people. That is a direction without a form. But tomorrow at work, I will initiate one brief, genuine conversation with someone I don't usually speak to. Notice what this does. It doesn't require you to believe anything new about yourself yet. It doesn't demand that the limiting thought has already been overcome. It gives the will somewhere specific to direct itself. A defined action that can be either done or not done with no ambiguity. You do it. The conversation happens. It may be brief, it may be slightly awkward, it may not be the elegant, effortless connection you imagined, but it happened. The old thought predicted you would avoid it, or that it would confirm how terrible you are at this. Instead, something occurred, an actual exchange. However imperfect, that imperfect exchange is evidence, real evidence, not a story you're telling yourself, an actual experience that slightly contradicts the dominant thought. You choose another specific action for the following day, another conversation, another small, defined social initiative. Each one produces more evidence. The evidence accumulates, and slowly, quietly, the dominant thought finds itself with less support from recent reality than it previously enjoyed. The will, in this framework, is responsible for two things: choosing the specific direction and returning to it when the mind becomes scattered or resistant. That's it. It doesn't need to guarantee the outcome. It doesn't need to prevent every instance of doubt. It only needs to choose and return. Choose the action. The doubt appears. Return to the action. The limiting thought resurfaces. Return to the action. The motivation dips. Return to the action. The return is the practice. The practice is the development. The development produces the evidence. The evidence changes what the mind can honestly believe. Atkinson was also careful to distinguish between two very different reasons for stopping. There is stopping that is the result of a conscious, examined decision. I have gathered enough information about this direction. It is not the right fit for where I want to go. I am choosing to redirect my efforts somewhere more aligned. This is intelligent use of the will. Knowing when to change direction is a skill, not a failure. And there is stopping. That is the result of a dominant thought gaining temporary authority. This is too hard. I probably wasn't suited for this. The timing isn't right. Maybe next year? This is not a decision. It is the old mental habit reasserting itself in the language of rational choice. The difference is whether the stopping was consciously examined or automatically generated. One is an act of will, the other is the absence of it. Atkinson's method, taken in its entirety, can be reduced to 5 movements that I want to leave you with, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical sequence you can actually use. The first movement is observation. Before you try to change anything, observe the dominant thought. Without arguing with it, let it become visible. Notice when it appears, what triggers it, what it causes you to do and not do. You cannot navigate around something you cannot see. The second movement is reclassification. Once the thought is visible, separate it from your identity. This thought is not a fact about your nature. It is a pattern that has been practiced often for a long time, and patterns, unlike nature, can be changed. I have repeated this. I have not been discovered. The third movement is definition. Choose a direction specific enough to guide one action, not an aspiration, not a feeling you want to achieve, but a concrete behavior you can actually perform today or tomorrow. The more specific and small, the better, because small actions can be completed, and completion creates evidence. The fourth movement is return. When the mind becomes scattered, as it will, and when the limiting thought reasserts itself, as it may, bring your attention back to the defined action, not with force, not with drama, not with a lengthy internal debate. Simply return to what you decided to do. The fifth movement is accumulation. Allow completed actions to become evidence. Not proof that you have completely changed, not evidence that the limiting thought was entirely wrong, just evidence that a different behavior was available, that the old identity's prediction was not the only possible outcome. And then repeat. These 5 movements are simple enough to describe in 2 minutes. Applied consistently over months and years, they are among the most transformative forces available to a human being. Because what Atkinson understood, what the entire framework of thought vibration is ultimately pointing toward, is that you are always becoming more practiced at something. Every day your mind is rehearsing something. It is practicing suspicion or openness, resentment or perspective, avoidance or engagement, self-protection or self-extension. The patterns you practice today are becoming the automatic responses of tomorrow, and the automatic responses of tomorrow will shape the experience of the year after that and the decade after that. You are not a fixed entity with a set of permanent characteristics. You are a dynamic process that is continually being shaped by what receives your sustained attention. This is not motivational rhetoric. This is the actual structure of how human minds develop over time. Atkinson called thought creative. And I want to be precise about what that means, because it is easy to misread this into something either mystical or naive. Thought is creative not because it magically produces external circumstances, not because wishing hard enough for something causes the universe to deliver it, not because your mental state has no limits and anything is possible if you just believe it strongly enough. Thought is creative because it produces decisions. Decisions produce actions. Actions shape habits. Habits build skills, relationships, financial patterns, and opportunities. And all of that, the cumulative product of years of decisions and actions and habits, eventually becomes what other people describe as your life. You cannot think your way out of every difficult circumstance. You cannot guarantee outcomes with mental discipline. You cannot control the choices of other people or the unpredictability of events. But you can think your way toward or away from a response. You can think your way into or out of an attempt. You can think your way closer to or further from the habits that compound over time into fundamentally different versions of a life. That is the creative power of thought, not magic, direction. The invisible circuit, how a thought returns as reality. Let me bring everything together now. Atkinson described what I want to call the invisible circuit, the process by which an internal thought, repeated often enough and accepted with sufficient emotional investment, eventually returns to you as an experience of external reality. It begins with a thought, not necessarily a dramatic one, a quiet one, perhaps so familiar you've stopped hearing it. I'm not someone who handles pressure well. The thought attracts attention. Your perception becomes sensitive to evidence that supports it. The times you've handled pressure poorly become vivid and easily recalled. The times you've performed well under pressure become fuzzy or get dismissed as luck or unusual circumstances. The filtered perception shapes interpretation. When pressure arrives, it gets labeled as evidence rather than experience. This is what I knew would happen. The prediction feels like insight rather than the self-fulfilling mechanism it actually is. The interpretation shapes behavior. You prepare differently when you expect to underperform. You communicate differently. You commit differently. You persist for a different amount of time. The behavior is measurably different from what it would be if the dominant thought were different. The behavior produces results, not random results, results that are systematically shaped by the quality and consistency of your engagement. And those results then return as what feels like objective evidence about your nature. See, I don't handle pressure well. I never have. The circuit is complete. The thought has traveled from inside your head into the structure of your actual life, and then come back to you disguised as reality, seeming to have been generated entirely by external forces. This is what your thoughts do in the dark. This is the dangerous and magnificent power that Atkinson spent his life trying to describe. It operates in every domain. In your finances, a dominant thought about scarcity affects not just how you feel about money, but what financial information you pay attention to, which conversations about opportunity you take seriously, which decisions you make when resources are tight, and whether you develop the habits that build stability over time. In your health, a dominant thought about your body's capabilities affects how you interpret physical discomfort, how consistently you engage with practices that support long-term well-being, how much evidence you need before you believe progress is real, and how quickly you return to your patterns after an interruption. In your relationships, a dominant thought about your worthiness of love and connection affects every dynamic in every relationship you have. The signals you send before words are exchanged, the way you interpret ambiguous gestures, how much vulnerability you allow, and what you do when conflict appears. In your work, a dominant thought about your contribution and capabilities affects the quality of your preparation, the boldness of your ideas, the clarity with which you advocate for what you believe in, and the resilience with which you respond to the inevitable setbacks. The circuit is everywhere. It is always running, and it remains invisible as long as the thought generating it has been mistaken for reality. The moment it becomes visible, the moment you can trace the thread from the thought to the attention, to the interpretation, to the behavior, to the result, the circuit loses its power to operate automatically. It can be interrupted at any point in the sequence. You can question the thought. You can audit the attention. You can choose a different interpretation. You can take an action the old identity would normally prevent. Any interruption changes what follows, and you do not have to wait until the thought is completely gone to begin. You do not need to achieve certainty before you act. You do not need to feel different before you behave differently. You only need to see clearly enough to take the next small action that the dominant thought was trying to prevent. One action, then another, then another. The evidence accumulates. The thought loses its monopoly. A different experience becomes possible. And eventually, without any single dramatic moment of transformation, you find yourself in a different life, one that was built not by circumstance, but by the slow, consistent, often invisible work of directing your mind somewhere worth going. This is Atkinson's final and most important message. You cannot choose every thought that enters your mind, but you can choose which thoughts receive your continued attention. You can choose which conclusions deserve to be examined before they are obeyed. You can choose which direction to give your consistent effort. The mind is always becoming more practiced at something. The only question is whether you are choosing what it practices. That is where mental power begins, not with perfect control, not with the absence of doubt, not with a life free of limiting thoughts. It begins the moment a thought that once sounded like reality becomes visible again. Once visible, it can be questioned. Once questioned, it no longer has to be obeyed. And once it no longer has to be obeyed, something new becomes possible. The thought that has been running your life. At the very beginning, I told you there is a thought living inside your head that has already decided your future. I want to come back to that now, not to alarm you, but to offer you something more useful than alarm. That thought is not your enemy. It is not evidence of weakness or failure or some fundamental flaw in your character. It is the product of a mind that has been doing exactly what minds do, organizing experience around patterns, building predictions from repetition, creating an efficient operating system from the data it has received. The thought is a habit, and a habit is not a sentence. For the next 24 hours, I want you to listen, not for the loud thoughts, not for the dramatic ones, but for the quiet ones that sound like facts. The ones that begin with, I always, or I never, or I'm just, or that's not really for someone like me. When you catch one, don't fight it. Don't replace it immediately with something more flattering. Just ask the single question that begins the entire process. What has this thought been causing me to notice, avoid, and do? That question moves the thought from identity back into observation. And an observed thought is already less powerful than an invisible one. Then choose one action, small, specific, completable, that the thought would normally prevent. Not to prove anything, not to transform your life overnight, just to create one piece of evidence that the thought did not expect. That is where it starts. Not with perfect understanding, not with total confidence, not with every limiting belief already resolved, with one visible thought, one honest question, one small action the old pattern would have avoided. That is enough to begin changing the direction of the circuit, and direction, sustained long enough, changes everything. If this exploration of William Walker Atkinson's thought vibration gave you a new way to see your own mind, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and before you close this, listen carefully to the next thought that sounds less like an idea and more like a description of who you are. That may be exactly the thought worth examining first.